What's up, Shred Sexies? Welcome back. Death to the Fingers. Got a bit of a cool one here. Essentially, someone was working on an arpeggio sequence and doing it diatonically. And they were asking me if I actually knew what the in-between steps were. So if you're going between the first and the second degree, there's actually a fret there between the two. So what arpeggio do you play off that fret? And I told them, honestly, that I'm like, I've been kind of working on it, but I haven't actually figured out a system that would actually explain which of those steps is definitively what you should use, right? I had some ideas, and they work, of course, but there's no concrete sort of theory behind it because I just didn't have the time to figure it out. And then I started watching a video by my boy, Chris Juergensen. He's an amazing guitar teacher on YouTube. All of the links for these videos are down below in the description. And he was talking about modal interchange, and that got me onto another video by this really killer pianist who does an amazing theory lesson on essentially modal interchange, what you saw me do in the arpeggio sequence there, based off his video. And then, of course, there's another video under that that's insanely dense with respect to theory, but basically goes through diminished concepts. So you can see that there's a lot of information there to essentially glean. And I think that's really the big part. If you want to play an arpeggio sequence like what I did at the beginning, if you want to understand this information, there are a lot of steps in between. It's like a house. You got the lumber and the nails and the shingles and the shutters and stuff like that. But at the end, people just see the finished product and not all of the labor and expertise that went into basically erecting it. And that's the same thing with an exercise like this. You're seeing the house at the end, not all of the steps that were happening in advance of that to give me the skill set, if you will, to be able to actually play an idea, come up with it, read the chart, and then basically, come up with this arpeggio sequence, which is obviously amazing practice. Once I show you the chart, you'll be like, damn, yeah, that's incredibly useful. So without further ado, we're going to go through each of the steps. And I'll show you how to acquire the skill set necessary to be able to play an example like that. And of course, once you get those skills, you'll be playing arpeggio sequence just like that. And that's just it. You're setting yourself a goal to be like, I want to be able to do that too. And so you're going to work on these skills on the instrument to be able to do that. Let's get into it. All right, step one has to be just playing the arpeggios, and obviously people can do that relatively easily. Anybody can read, like a scale chart or read some tabs or whatever it is. But the true takeaway here is understanding the power of inversions, and therefore you can turn one arpeggio into 3 arpeggios or 4 or 5, depending on however many notes there are in the actual chord you're using. And that's a very powerful tool because now you can break down the fretboard. I can play a major arpeggio at the first degree, the third degree, and the fifth degree, right? The same notes that I extract from the major scale to make a major triad chord. Shocker, right? So now I can basically arrange those notes 1, 3, 5, starting at the first degree, the third degree, and the fifth degree, obviously to come up with 3 distinct shapes. I can do the same thing for minor. I can now extend that principle to diminished and augmented. Although it applies a little bit differently because those things are symmetrical and it gets a little weird. So I'm not going to get into it, but the basic principle is the same. So in the first example, you'll see me just do a major minor sequence where I ascend using G major, right, in the first degree, then the third degree, starting off the note B, obviously, starting off the note D, the fifth degree. And then I'll jump up to the E minor sequence, obviously the sixth degree, the 12th fret, and then move down again to the third degree. So now you like the third degree, I got a major and a minor arpeggio that exist in the same place. It's just a different configuration of notes there. That's weird. And it happens again at the first degree. Shocker! So that's very useful information, especially for later on in this video when I start talking about it. So you start to see these relationships. That becomes incredibly useful later on when you're like thinking about a position. You're like, do I want major or do I want minor? But the big takeaway here is this idea that you're going to use inversions. And of course, in the secondary example, I use dominant 7 and minor 7 from the dominant 7 chord family. Again, I'm breaking down the fretboard. I'm basically using the sound to move around. I'm doing it at the 7th degree. I'm doing it at the 2nd degree for dominant 7. I'm using it at the 4th degree. I'm using it at the fifth degree. For minor 7, again, it's the relative minor, in this case E minor, so I'm playing it at the 6th degree, the 5th degree, jumping down to the 3rd degree, and then jumping down one more time to the 1st degree. Notice I don't even need the guitar. My mind just knows where these arpeggios are, and that's really a big part of being able to play the sequence, is your mastery and knowledge about connecting the dots. To be like, if I'm at the Ionian position, I can play all of this stuff, including a major and minor triad arpeggio. The major in the root inversion and the minor in the first inversion. And once you start thinking like that, you'll be able to recall this information very quickly while you're playing, and then boom, done deal. But obviously this is foundational information. If you cannot understand this and you cannot play these types of sequences, well, you're going to have to work on that first before you get on the stuff that we're doing in the intro. Mint, next. All right, I scooped this chart here from the video, which is amazing. Go check it out. Honestly, if you're looking for an incredibly useful music resource, that YouTube channel is one. It's excellent. So thumbs up. Use it. But you can see basically my entire arpeggio sequence is just me moving around the outside circle. That's it. Okay, I didn't really do any of the extra ones that you see branch out, whether they're inside or outside, just the ones on the main ring, if you will. And in certain instances, I swapped out the arpeggio that it says to do there, and I considered it instead a position. So when I got to B diminished, instead of playing the actual B diminished arpeggio at the very end, I do dominant 7, which is superimposed over top of that B diminished position, the D7 there, to allow me, in this case, it was actually G7, because we're playing in the key of C, and obviously the dominant 7 chord is the 5th degree of the major key you're working in. So C's 5th degree is G, so it makes a G7. Nails it, I know. And that happens at the 7th degree of a major scale. You get a dominant 7 arpeggio. So I just swapped it in there. And that's because I understood the power of a position. Okay, so that's a really important piece of information right there. You don't have to consider each one of these things as this sort of written in stone, you must play this. Instead, you can look at it and be like, well, that's a major triad. So that happens at the 1st degree, the 4th degree, and the 5th degree of a major scale, which means that I can now either play Ionian, Lydian, or Mixolydian. Well, you can all of a sudden understand the number of choices, right? So in these examples, you'll see me start off with the simple stuff, the stuff you have to know, like the chord associated with the scale degree, Ionian in this case. And then you get the major scale. Then you'll get an arpeggio, both major and minor, that happen to be overlapped there. Of course, from the, again, the inversions section. And last but not least, you'll get the pentatonic. So those are the big ones. But in the second one, Dorian, you'll see me kick it up where I'm all of a sudden adding dominant 7 and diminished. Because all of those things happen at the Dorian position. I get the harmonic minor. I didn't throw in the melodic minor because it sounded weird, but you could do it there too. So all of a sudden you see this information accumulates exponentially. And instead of it just being one chord, one scale, one sort of minor pentatonic scale or something like that, you now have literally 20 or 30 options to draw from because you have the other sympathetic minor keys, Aeolian and Phrygian. You love it. Okay, so the power of a position. start thinking in terms of positions and being like, I have all of these choices, because when I was playing the major triad inversions and the minor triad inversions, at the first degree, I get both major and minor, just like at the third degree. So you make a mental note and you're like, okay, whenever I'm playing in the Ionian position, I can play this arpeggio or that arpeggio. Job's done. Next. All right, obviously the diatonic sequence here, you just heard me play it. That's ground zero right there. I was able to knock this little exercise out in the first take because I already was pretty damn good at doing the diatonic sequence. And obviously, having done that for so long and so many times, when I looked at the next arpeggio in the sequence on this chart, and I saw that it was major, I was just like, oh, okay, we'll just play a major triad or a minor triad. And then, of course, I'm at the level now where I can think about things as a position. So then I started to make substitutions as necessary to be like, well, I can spice it up and make it sound more interesting and give the arpeggio sequence a broader spectrum and give me an even more devastating workout, obviously, which is what I'm trying to do. But that diatonic sequence right there is so important, and I don't think a lot of people practice it or play it or even use it to the full extent. And we're going to look at this in the actual guitar course, where we start to use this diatonic sequence in ways that you didn't even actually consider, by mixing and matching minor and major inversions and whatnot over top of the diatonic sequence to completely rearrange how it sounds. So you break out of this traditional major to minor to minor to major, major, minor, diminished kind of thing, right? Which is a trap that everybody falls into, and myself included. So if you really want to do the arpeggio sequences, this is literally ground zero. Once you get the arpeggios down, you can actually play them. Once you understand the inversions, which should be the next step, you take it and you apply it to the diatonic scale, and you start doing them by position. Later on, you'll expand your knowledge with respect to each one of those positions and what you can play there, and just substitute in whatever tool it is you want, a scale, an arpeggio, a pentatonic, or something else more exotic, like 3-in-1 or something else like that, or sequence, or a fancy other scale like melodic minor or harmonic minor. So that right there is very important. So just to sum up here, we're talking about basically just developing the physical skill to actually play an arpeggio with the technique necessary as far as the sweep is concerned, with the pick, obviously, and the rolling of the fingers for the various triads, major, minor, diminished, and augmented. Then you're going to start to learn the inversions and the sequence to break down the fretboard. From there, you're going to apply that triad theory to the diatonic scale. So you get major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished. Then after that, there's like an in-between step where you can start to mix and match the inversions. So instead of playing major at the first degree, you're going to play minor at the first degree, moving to minor to the second degree, moving to major at the third degree. I know, shocker. You're like, what? What did you just say? If you knew what I just said there, you're awesome. Okay, so there's that. And then, of course, you're going to evolve these triads up to the dominant sevens. You're going to factor those in now. And at the very end, you're going to then start to arrange them with the help of a chart like this. And any one of these arrows, obviously, will allow you to create a path from one chord to the next. So obviously, it's very, very, very powerful for songwriting. You might want to grab one of these for yourself. The link is in the description below. Go watch the video. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about after you watch that. It's a fantastic video. And then, of course, the final stage of awareness, if you will, is that you can now consider each one of these little bubbles that has a chord in it, right? Whether it's major, minor, diminished, or something else. If it says G9 or something, you're like, oh, okay, that's dominant 7 territory. So that should open a lot of doors. You're like bebop scale and a whole bunch of other things, right? So it's not just the chord or the 5th degree or something like that. There's a whole bunch more information that goes with this particular type of chord. And so you can think about it as a position or a chord tonality, right? Obviously, the major flavor ends up on 1, 4, and 5. So there it is. I like to think of positions, but you do you. You can do it by chord too. Major chords, minor chords, dominant 9s, dominant 7s, dominant 13s, diminished 7s, blah, 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 until you turn blue in the face. To me, that just gets confusing because my brain don't work like that. It prefers to be like 1 because I'm a simpleton. So there it is, okay? You got to basically start to get into your mind that you got to ramp up these skill set, and then at the very end, you can put it all together like I did in the intro by playing major triads and minor triads with dominant 7s and doing substitutions. So like at the second last arpeggio sequence is playing, instead of playing this B diminished here, I actually played a dominant 7 in the inversion that happens at the Locrian position where this B actually exists. You see what I'm getting at? And there it is. Bada bing, bada boom. Then I can do a 5-1, yes, cadence, which lets me end my little idea. You see what I mean? Closes the loop. So notice I put all the music skills in there, regardless of the fact that I was just doing a big sort of like arpeggio sequence. At one point in time, I'm like, it'd probably be better to do a 5-1 here rather than 7-1 because it'll sound more musically pleasing. Done. And try G7 flat 9 to the root. That is an absolutely phenomenal chord movement for cadences. That's classic Bach there. G7 flat 9 to C major. Boom. Do that as an arpeggio. You'll be like, right. End of video. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate every single one of you. We'll see you in the next one.